Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible provides an easily accessible way to access audiobooks for its members, just one of the reasons why I recommend it, along with enabling you to make huge savings on the newest full-length Warhammer audiobooks. As an Audible member, you get 1 credit every month to use on any title across their entire premium selection, but clearly credits best spent on those longer 9-hour plus premium audiobooks. Given the theme of the video, I decided to select a couple of audiobooks to suit. KRIEG straddles both the Death Korps of KRIEG in the modern Imperium, as well as laying out the history and the horror that turned their planet to a death world. The second is the classic First and Only, Book 1 in the Gaunt's Ghost series. Both of these offer lashings of guard action, and I'll share some thoughts on both at the end of the video today. You can start today using Audible with a free 30-day Audible trial to get yourself full access to thousands of audiobooks, originals and podcasts. All you need to do is visit audible.com/Luton, and for those in the US, you can also text Luton to 500 500. Now, on my pending list of dedicated breakdowns to make, the Imperial Guard are still up there, along with those sisters and yes, the Astartes, and we'll inevitably get to speaking more about the Guard in a more general sense later. But as you may have sensed over time, my content delivery plan is, let's just say, chaotic. And don't overthink the use of that term. I already got sent a mystery box this week by the Imperium. It's surely the Inquisitors trying to trick me again. Those idiots. So today, much like our recent look at the Legion of the Damned, when it came to deciding on a piece, it seemed suddenly obvious to go all in on an upside down approach, generic Cadian Guard later, gas-masked KRIEG now. So let's jump into the bizarre, nuclear annihilated world of KRIEG and its soul-destroying warriors who have become among the most fabled warriors of the galaxy, the Imperium and 40k. Let us discuss now the Death Korps of KRIEG. The Death Korps of KRIEG are considered by many to be the most 40k of 40k things. They're unrelenting, merciless, emotionless. They're the most inhuman of humanity's soldiers. For the Guardsmen of KRIEG, all their humanity has been stripped away long before they see active service beyond their homeworld. Thus the general impression other Imperial Guard regiments have of those who hail from KRIEG is that of fearless, unrelenting, uncaring machines of war for whom not merely victory but fulfilling their objectives comes at any cost. And that cost, of course, being generally their lives. The same could be said, of course, for any Guard regiment, yet unlike other Guard regiments who, unless the objective is truly critical, may at some point consider a tactical retreat or consolidation of their positions. For the Guardsmen of KRIEG, no cost is too high. No ground shall be given, no retreat, no surrender, no thought to the cost paid in human lives. This mentality is embedded within the soldiers of KRIEG, often to a point where their sacrifice becomes seemingly and often literally counterproductive in the eyes of others. Whereas guardsmen from Cadia and Mordian might hold a line, take shelter, wait for a tactical opportunity or the cover of darkness to make an assault. Those from KRIEG would jump out from their defences, running silently into a wall of oncoming fire. The soldiers of KRIEG are the very definition of grinding down an enemy through attrition. Where others hesitate, the Death Korps of KRIEG wields one weapon like no other Imperial Guard regiment, that being sheer blinkered willpower. The human soldiers of the Imperium are spread across hundreds of thousands of hive and bastion worlds of the apparent million Imperial planets of the galaxy, which constitutes the domain of humanity in M41. They look to their own defence and to that of the Imperium itself. They carry out the hellfire of war in the name of the Emperor and engage in those actions as decreed by the Administratum and the other officials of the Imperium, the Lord Commander, other ranking Imperials. And although the Imperium wields massive military force which spans the entire galaxy, each world which exists under the banner of the Imperium is required to raise its own standing armies. They must also equip and maintain said forces for defence and deployment as requested by the Imperium. The soldiers who maintain defence of hive worlds and other civilised planets are mere militia. Sometimes these are referred to as planetary defence forces. The difference though between a planetary militia, which can be quite variable in both their training, equipment, discipline and just general standards, comparative to the Imperium's Astra Militarum, is considerable. For those required for service in the Guard as decreed by the Imperium, demanded via the Imperial Tithe or campaign requisition, those of a planetary militia or draft will be called into service. For many, this means their lives will be changed forever and often considerably shortened. They leave behind their past selves as infinitely dispensable ignorant workers, generally speaking a class of hive peasantry, or of course crazed rabid gang members who proliferate all areas but that of the more civilized levels of hive worlds, and of course the anonymous but slightly more capable grinding industrial workers who trudge back and forth from their lives of heavy fabrication and servitude, whose sole life goals are likely a few more credits per month, a warmer hab cell, perhaps even a slightly larger hab cell. But careful now, such fanciful dreams are surely the path to damnation. Better we keep our minds on our work. Too many thoughts, dreams and questions surely invites the curiosity of supervisors, enforcers and ecclesiarchy observers. Many within a hive city will of course have seen some small sense of combat in their lives. Hive cities are brutally unforgiving places even for the more calm areas, and for those who cannot stand up for themselves, they will surely be devoured by its darkest corners. Even then, a decent sense of survival and the ability to take a few punches is not nearly enough to serve within the Imperium's Astra Militarum. Although of course in saying that, for a lot of people they're not going to have a lot of choice one way or the other, because when drafted, those anonymous dregs of human detritus will be taken and reforged as soldiers of the Imperium, equipped with all they'll need to serve, standing in tight rows as new and highly disciplined members of the largest of all Imperial armies which exist in M41, who march to the endless wars against the traitors, the heretics and the Xenos under the galactic banner of the Imperium of Mankind, the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard. All Imperial soldiers are as noted equipped as will befit a member of the Imperial Guard. At a base level, this merely means being issued with the required standard gear, but the Imperium is large enough that it can of course accommodate localized specific weapons and apparel. For the lucky few, those in systems near to infantry specialized forge worlds, they may have access to more refined personal weapons for example and be trained in their use. Consequently, some worlds may field highly specialised units wielding some of the best infantry weapons the Imperium can offer, carrying say plasma guns, melter weapons, other support weaponry. Upon other worlds, while they may be given the default weaponry of what some would consider the baseline soldiery for the Imperial Guard, the environment of their worlds may dictate other standard issue items. Obviously, on a frozen world, being just issued a standard Cadian gear isn't going to be enough to weather the sub-zero conditions. Similarly, on a jungle death planet, squads having access to additional scanning tools may mean the difference between a patrol returning or not. For the soldiers of KRIEG, their respirators are not merely worn for intimidation. That is part of it, but they're essential for those who have learned to fight upon one of the most inhospitable worlds within the Imperium. Their trench shovels are an integral part of their fighting doctrine as well. When brought into close combat, these are surely as lethal as any Kadashan machete or Mordian bayonet. Of course, in theory, should any forces found to be lacking or wanting in any regard, regional commanders or planetary governors should likely be stripped of their positions, their families disgraced, and in the most egregious of examples, additional censure or other punishment, sometimes in public, designated by the powers that be, the Inquisition, Administratum, or the Lord Commander himself, although pretty unlikely. But all of this is just in theory. In actuality, I'd consider it a safe bet that within many campaigns, regiments go to battle with second-hand equipment and just whatever is to hand. For the veil of propaganda is both blinding and suffocating within the Imperium. Whatever we may presume is the standard operational fare for the many thousands of humans pressed into service the chances are it's far from the truth. Sometimes better, but far more often worse. The Imperium wields some of the most devastatingly powerful forces in the galaxy, which it will not hesitate to throw down against its numerous enemies. Powerful forces such as the Astartes, the Titan legions of the Mechanicus, Night Houses, and countless other surgical strike tools such as the members of the Officio Assassinorum. Yet for all the terrifying Xenos threats that exist, or the pervasive ever-present nightmares of the Warp, when it comes down to it, the Imperium spends considerably more time quelling rebellions and civil wars within its own borders. These smaller scale rebellions are the bread and butter of war in the galaxy of M41. This is why the more human of human forces such as the Militarum de Sororitas exist in the first place. They are of course pitted against the most horrifying enemies of mankind, but across countless human worlds that attempt to throw off the shackles of the Imperium, these absurd upstart rebellions must be continually put down to maintain the ever-dominating empire of the Emperor of Man's Imperium. And were it not for the crushing hammer of the Militarum, the Imperium as it stands would simply not survive. These are not the halcyon days of M30 when the legions of Astartes crushed or welcomed worlds back to humanity. By M41, the Astartes spend most of their time suppressing and holding the line against far more dangerous and horrifying enemies than a traitorous planetary governor with ideas above his station. So it's not unreasonable to say that without the Imperial Guard, the Imperium would truly struggle to maintain its grip on the galactic dominion of humanity. And I should also note, within the summarised further exploration of KRIEG today, there are of course some spoilers to anyone who wishes to listen to the audiobook first. But with that, let's learn more about the Death Korps of KRIEG. The Imperial Guardsmen of KRIEG are well known for their ability to weather campaigns which become heavily entrenched stalemates, with subsequent engagements becoming wars of material firepower. One might question how this could even arise given the nature of warfare in M41 and the ability for orbital firepower. The answer of course is relatively straightforward. On planets of the Imperium which rebel or whose leadership is overthrown, they often have considerable material resources, as well as holding valuable production and infrastructure systems that if able to be captured without orbital obliteration, all the better. And this is why you will see ground campaigns of hundreds of thousands, even millions of Imperial soldiers who are very much the most disposable resource. And when it comes to the soldiers of KRIEG, this mentality is carried forward to its most extreme form. Of course, even for well-disciplined and trained guardsmen, such long, hazardous engagements can become mentally difficult to maintain. The conditions and steady losses can lead to the slow crushing of the human spirit. Yes, they are the Imperial Guard, they serve the Emperor, but they're still human at the end of the day, and while there will always be those individuals who are zealous in their service or strong in their willpower, for the considerable majority of ordinary guardsmen, there's only so many months of soul-crushing horror that even the most loyal servants of the Imperium can endure. For those who would seek to flee, of course, they will either be killed outright or pressed into service within the penal legions. But where the conditions are so devastating that it becomes difficult to maintain morale, this is where you would see the Death Korps of KRIEG enter the fray. For as we noted, they are truly the masters of attrition. Their ability to weather and endure suffering is near unrivaled to a point it becomes concerningly morbid. Adjacent serving Imperials who have found themselves being relieved by or having fought alongside the Death Korps have noted it to be extremely disturbing how casually they will expend their lives. So depressing is the loss of life for ordinary guardsmen, their presence can even be counterproductive for morale with supporting forces. It has been said that on occasion, commissars have deemed it necessary to in fact order the forces of KRIEG from throwing themselves so casually at an enemy or engaging in acts of self-sacrifice that amounted to a truly depressing waste of human life, in the service of often only achieving minimally important objectives. And even in the face of crushing wars of attrition, they maintain an almost passive emotional level. So the important question is, when did the Death Korps of KRIEG begin to display these characteristics? And why do they care so little for their comrades in battle and their own selves? How are they seemingly so fearless? How are they willing to throw away their lives without so much as a second thought? How did they become so adept at battles of material attrition in the worst environmental conditions possible? Why do they wear such terrifying uniforms that are both bleak and intimidating. But most importantly of all, what is underneath those respirator masks. As is very often the case with the history and rumours concerning notable planets, the story of the world known as KRIEG is shrouded in half-truths and dark myths. It seems reasonable to assume that given the definition of the world of KRIEG may never have understood the translation of its own title. This is not uncommon in M41, where words of ancient human history have completely altered or their original definition just lost. Yet it seems of course wildly ironic for a planet which has seen the complete and total annihilation of its own ecosystem, its entire surface scoured and its entire population turned into the production of war alone. It's a poignant and fitting name for such a bleak world of bitter endurance. KRIEG in M41 is an extremely irradiated planet. Its entire surface is a nuclear wasteland. Its hive cities are now little more than rubble and ash. Its atmosphere unbreathable, or at least to say highly toxic. It remains so inhospitable that even inquisitors who visited for a brief time ended up suffering from its environment and became gravely ill as a result. The Death Korps, though, maintained that despite the extreme conditions, what occurred was absolutely necessary, that their saviour Colonel Yurton did what had to be done, that he saved the people of KRIEG by committing great sin himself. He did his duty. He brought people back to the light of the Emperor via the tools gifted by the Master of Mankind. Those tools were, of course, the horrifyingly powerful atomic weapons of the Dark Age of technology. It's relevant that earlier we noted that within the Imperium, much of the unending war of the far future is in fact fought among humanity itself, and so the fall of KRIEG came about not entirely dissimilarly to the world of Rofanon that we've also previously explored. KRIEG was at one time a thriving hive and industrial world, not unlike so many other hive worlds. In fact, it was probably not especially noteworthy. Its population, like most hive worlds, numbered in the tens of billions. Its primary known hive cities were Oros, Ferrograd, and Argentus. And also not unlike many hive worlds, the rulers had become swollen with their industrial achievements and contracts. The upper echelons of many imperial worlds for this reason are very often riven by petty rivalries and family squabbles over power. The autocratic nature of the Imperium trickles down into hive worlds, and as such inevitably the rulers of hive worlds fear any threats that could unseat them and rob them of their comfort, wealth and power. Perhaps though somewhat unusually, this led in this instance the leaders of the various hive cities to steadily invest more and more into their own militias, creating very huge, powerful private armies that stood ready to defend the leadership of the planet against any outside threats, and of course to also limit any threats from others upon the world itself who might seek to expand their own power. The time at which this begins to become noted in the wider Imperium is when we're introduced to one Colonel Yurton, who after running highly successful campaigns against Chaos Cultists off-world of KRIEG in mid-M40, he's interrogated by an Inquisitor, and it's explained that the Administratum and Munitorum are growing concerned about the situation on KRIEG, especially the inability to draw reinforcements from the home world. Yurton supports their assertions that he's having difficulties in gaining reinforcements himself. So Yurton and the Inquisition share similar concerns to just what is occurring on KRIEG. So Colonel Yurton is ordered to return and investigate, replenish his regiment, report back. Things do not go to plan. Back on KRIEG, the leaders there are becoming disillusioned with their required contributions to the Imperium and of the Imperial Administratum. Again, not entirely dissimilarly to Rofanon, who took issue with the demands made by the wider Imperium upon their world, both taking issue with their populace having to leave and fight on worlds they've never even heard of, and the appalling flippancy that is given in regard to the loss of human life. This steadily embittered outlook would create a schism in the ruling council of KRIEG, as the Imperium demanded ever more resources. Resources the leadership began to argue were its to do with as they saw necessary. Translation: to defend themselves and maintain their positions of power. On returning to KRIEG, Yurton sees that this cannot likely end well or with any diplomatic resolution. Predictably, shortly after his arrival, the traitors proclaim publicly their secession from the Imperium, and the so-called chairman orders any non-KRIEG to leave the planet in 3 days. Jotun is already very much on the radar of the rebels. In short order, things fall apart. Jotun is contained within Hive Ferrograd, while the chairman and his military leadership are within Hive Oros. As the civil war begins, traitors within Hive Ferrograd are being publicly executed. The civilians barely notice anything has changed. They heard one day something about not being in the Imperium anymore, but now they are again under Colonel Jotun. They shrug it off and barely give it much further thought. Meanwhile, within Hive Oros, things are also not going smoothly. For the traitors of the chairman's newly minted KRIEG People's Army, reports are already coming in of attempted sabotage. Small cells of resistance are also making their own preparations. In true autocratic fashion, the governor of KRIEG ordered any who would stand with him to enforce a planetary martial law. But small arms fire and civil unrest are now becoming daily occurrences around Hive Oros. I should note, this was not a situation where any worship or corruption of chaos seems to have been involved as a trigger. There's no evidence which points to this. It's likely this was merely a case of a hugely egotistical, power-mad leader, and undoubtedly surrounded by figures who protected them from the oncoming nightmare of reality. So a surprising amount of the planet stayed with the governor's rebelling forces, and consequently the world fell quite quickly under the general banner of the traitors. Again, noting them being classed as traitors in the specifically non-chaos sense in this instance. Soon after the start of the war, it appears that Colonel Jotun's daughter, Captain Sabella Jotun, appears before the autocratic leadership of the traitors, speaking specifically to the figure known as the chairman. For whatever reason, she appears to be acting against the interests of her father, who she seemingly barely knows, with him having spent so much time off-world. She wants to lead a strike team into Hive Ferrograd. The chairman continues to remain baffled that not all the citizenry are on his side. He blames this dismissively upon the indoctrination of the Imperium and the churches and cathedrals that they, in hindsight, stupidly allowed to be built upon their world as part of the Imperium. He also decides, like all dictators, to ignore the advice of his generals and orders the very bad decision to settle the unrest in their own hive city of Oros first, before they worry about how to deal with Colonel Jotun and Ferrograd. They consider that nothing is very likely to happen in the interim. Interestingly, and perhaps against what we might wish to presume, for as traitorous as this chairman, the leader of the rebellion against the Imperium, is, he seems far less willing to throw away the lives of the citizenry unless absolutely pushed to do so, comparative to, say, leaders of the Imperium. Which I suppose makes sense when that's one of their core reasons for wanting to secede from the Imperium in the first place. Regardless of that one laudable trait though, he remains a petulant, egotistical leader, unable to tolerate even the smallest criticism of his decisions, and the fact that things are going far from smoothly and that the world did not immediately fall under his control with a ringing chorus of approval is already causing tantrums. To add to the stress of things, the chairman is then nearly killed by a bomb in his armoured limousine within Hive Oros, which they had felt to be their rock-solid home territory. This understandably shakes the chairman at his near assassination so early into his effort to break free from the Imperium. Clearly many citizens upon the world of KRIEG, even within Oros, are not so accepting of this attempt to grab supreme executive power over the world. Colonel Jotun's daughter does lead her mission into Hive Ferrograd on the pretext of attempting to assassinate Jotun, but then surprisingly she pivots on this, declaring her intention to defect and to join them, allowing herself to be captured. Is this part of some master plan though? The chairman, under immense pressure, feels pushed into attacking Ferrograd and Jotun. It's clear that Colonel Jotun's unbreakably zealous belief in the Imperium offers no compromise or alternatives. The chairman had seemed unwilling to commit to a civil war without exhausting all other opportunities, but any that were speculated had now been proven all dead ends. Jotun was given a last chance for communications, after which war upon KRIEG would properly commence. The rebels' singular objective: to raze Hive City Ferrograd to the ground. It is true that the loyalists were unfortunately grossly outnumbered, yet they refused to relinquish the world to the traitors who turned against the Emperor. Only their hive city, Ferrograd, remained to stand against the power-mad governor and those others who lacked the will to resist. Within Ferrograd, the 83rd Imperial Guard Regiment under Colonel Yurton became a point to which any and all remaining loyalists began to flock to. Their situation was far from being enviable. In fact, their situation was bleak and some would say hopeless. The number of traitor rebels they were facing was unknowable. Some speculated hundreds of thousands of soldiers, some suggested even millions. The total number is not known. Yurton had already received communication that no Imperial fleet was anywhere near a distance to which it could soon help them to secure the world. They were outnumbered, cut off, and their impending destruction seemed inevitable. His orders, though, were clear. Resist. Resist by any means necessary, no matter the cost. Engage the enemy, stand, fight, and punish the traitors. Make them suffer, make them regret their outrageous error, and show them how the Imperium responds to such audacious treachery. Bold words, but undoubtedly the communications sent by whichever Imperial authority had connected with Yurton were unable to completely appreciate the impossible situation they were in. The nature of long-distance communication within the Imperium and its astropaths is far from crystal clear. Nonetheless, they had communicated with clarity what he must do in this situation. Still, Hive Ferrograd was a heavily reinforced hive city of production. This helped the loyalists put the traitors at a distinct disadvantage, unable to easily then resupply themselves. Thereby, they were forced into assaulting the loyalists at Ferrograd first. Despite their much higher numbers, time was not on their side, and the 83rd Regiment of Yurton were all experienced in this kind of embedded defensive mission. So all they could realistically do for now was hold the line and wait for some opportunity to present itself. Many hoped that when Hive Oros would begin to run low on resources, they may be able to force some kind of compromise, at least until Imperial reinforcements could arrive. But 18 months in, both sides are fighting ever more bitterly. Trench networks have appeared, continual air assaults and artillery are pounding back and forth. KRIEG's war would be lost by the first side to exhaust their resources. Every soldier, every citizen of Ferrograd has to pull their weight. Yurton's forces had two major factors on their side. The first was their unwavering commitment to the Emperor of Mankind, while the Chairman's forces, they thought, fought for nothing. Not exactly sure that's true though, because arguably the Chairman's forces were fighting for their own freedom, which is a pretty motivating factor. However, Yurton held one significant ace up his sleeve, and that ace was named Archmagos Greel. Greel was a long-serving companion of Yurton's and often knew his decisions before he made them himself. He was an extremely adept member of the Mechanicus, but Yurton despised his modifications and inhuman approach to matters. They were very much chalk and cheese, but depended on each other greatly. Greel had so far drawn up plans to modify the Loyalists' las weapons. It was a more powerful iteration of the standard lasgun, but consumed more energy per shot. Yurton deemed this an acceptable trade-off. Its users would simply have to pick their shots and be accurate, but if they could make them count, it would give them an edge in combat. The war would continue in a miserable back and forth, steadily grinding each other down. It's claimed by Imperial history that the Chairman then died somewhere around this time, a sickly, broken shell of a man with many sundry aches and pains. His weakened self made a permanent retreat to his bedchamber, where he would remain to wallow in his woes, not to mention in his silk sheets, fine food and potent drink. He remained extremely comfortable, as long as he could blot out everything beyond his four walls. This was impossible to do, of course, and so his heart ached with resentful self-pity. According to the Imperial side of things, he gave in to lethargy, eventually struggling even to rise from his bed. In his mind he'd failed, his world fractured forever, and all he could do was cling to his self-appointed title, unwilling to accept any responsibility for his own shortcomings and the blood on his hands. He sought of course to blame it all upon one man, whose name he frequently cursed. Yet even then he couldn't fully accept the reality of this, because were he to do so, he would have to attempt to reconcile the fact that it was he who authorised Yurton's ship to enter orbit and dock within Hive Ferrograd. This must have posed a difficult paradox for the Chairman, his situation all of his own making, but unable to face the harsh reality of his utter personal failure. It is said that one day, in his isolation, his servants failed to appear. In his indignant rage, he rang for them harder and harder. but then he could hear footsteps and raised voices. Then came the gunshots, followed by cries. His fattened, struggling heart was on the brink of bursting. Sweat poured down him, and he attempted to flail his clammy, cold body out of his grand silk bedchamber. One of his servants burst in, hurriedly trying to block the door as they attempted to flee. Suddenly the door blasted into splinters. Yellow gas poured in from the corridor outside. The chairman was sent crashing to the floor, the mist burning his skin and lungs. The room suddenly filled with dark, towering figures, wheezing through their skull masks. A plea tumbled off his tongue. "I'll give you anything you want." But it said that out of lifelong habit, he also uttered a prayer to the Emperor, which went unanswered. His eyes finally attuned to the monsters in the yellow fog with their leering skulls instead of faces. Black eyes and distended snouts. Those who still recall this time claim that here the chairman broke down in tears of bitter regret and repented of his heresies, though no one can know this for sure. The last thing he would see was that of the masked face of a loyalist breathing heavily through their respirator, looking down without pity or malice. Some claim they killed him there and then with a powerful lasbolt to the head, others that the poison gas would surely have melted his skin and began to liquefy his brain. An agonizing death and surely more appropriate than wasting ammunition. None can know the truth for sure. This though is where things become more complicated. It had been presumed that the death of the chairman may enable some kind of compromise or de-escalation of the situation, but it soon became clear this was certainly not the case. Colonel Yerton and the traitor General Kraus would converse at length about the situation, but it becomes apparent that the enemy remain as embittered and blinkered as ever. The death of the chairman has changed nothing at all. To make matters worse, it appears that Yerton's daughter perished in their planned assassination assault against the chairman. Colonel Yerton was too iron-willed an individual to be shaken by such a revelation. They knew this was a risk on any mission, yet it certainly did nothing to pacify the entrenched positions of loyalist and traitor. The traitors merely reiterated their objections of remaining under the subjugation of the Emperor, that they did not accept the reality of being forced to endure and sacrifice their lives for the anonymous Imperium beset against horrors of the galaxy. Again, this is a common complaint by any who choose to rise up against the Imperium. The situation for the Loyalists is looking increasingly bleak, and under even heavier bombardment from the air, they have begun digging deep under their hive city, widening tunnels and storage facilities, creating a city below the city. The Archmagos reveals to Yerton that there exists a stock of technology below the surface from the Dark Age. It's unknown precisely what is contained there, leaving Yerton uncertain about what they could be potentially unleashing upon the planet in the near future. But he and the remaining Loyalists had of course committed to following their orders to the letter. They must find some way by which to deny the planet to the traitors, as was dictated to them at any cost, by any means necessary. Interestingly, despite how history often considers his actions, it's revealed to us that Colonel Yerton was originally strongly against the use of atomic weapons. The Archmagos explained that as they originated from the Dark Age, the Mechanicus only had fragments of their schematics, and so were unwilling to dismantle them for fear of accidentally detonating them. So instead, vaults like this one must remain locked away. It was said though that even one of the weapons could be enough to contaminate and strongly poison the land for many generations, and just one would be enough to effectively destroy an entire hive city. The difficulty though was in their delivery. Such slow and obvious missiles would generally easily be intercepted by fighters or air defences of a hive city, making a direct attack problematic. As the war continues to grind on, Yerton is seeing a distinct lack of progression, and so then begins to consider that maybe the cost of lives in the use of a nuclear weapon is warranted to end the overall conflict. This harsh rationalization proves to be extremely disturbing to his close aides, so much so that they choose to even anonymously contact the traitor General Kraus in a vague attempt to dissuade him from pushing the war further, out of fear that Yerton may then actually use the deadly Dark Age weapons. Unfortunately, without an explicitly detailed explanation, General Kraus is unable and unwilling to really comprehend the threat that is being posed, nor does he even believe it's a serious threat. Perhaps it's just mind games to put them at some disadvantage. But Kraus also felt a troubling gut feeling, a gnawing sting of unease, something he remembers about the chairman speaking of long ago, stories of weapons from the Dark Age, before the Age of Strife. He tried hard to recall, but couldn't specifically draw the information. He was probably just being paranoid, overthinking things. One of Yerton's trusted officers is panicking about the use of these weapons, and in doing so attempts to visit the vault where they're being kept, only to find to his horror they have all been removed. Of course they've been removed by Yerton and Griel, and things are now reaching a critical point. Yerton had clearly spent many weeks and months calculating all possibilities in coordination with Archmagos Griel. He was a straight-talking Imperial officer, and his belief in the Emperor so strong that he felt no shame in his conclusions. There was nothing to hide here, nothing that couldn't be discussed. In his mind, they had limited options. Because, realistically, the alternatives were surrender, failure, and certain death. The enemy would not entertain any compromise, plus Colonel Yerton had been ordered not to accept any himself. So he would clearly lay out to his officers the situation and the strategy, even to those that he clearly knew had considerable fears or doubts. He explained to them calmly and clearly exactly what these weapons were, why, and how he planned to use them. Yerton did not ask for any opinions on his strategy, he made statements, as always. He would declare exactly what was going to happen and how it must be carried out. To him, there was no alternative other than to launch a preemptive strike against the enemy hive city. They felt confident that by sending one missile first, the surprise of using a weapon that the enemy had no ability to expect nor understand would demonstrate the power they hold and the futility of continuing the war. Shockingly, after this meeting, the officers attempt to relieve Yerton from duty. Suspiciously, he calmly agrees, only to have loyal elites launch a surprise attack and kill them all, with Yerton then delivering a final execution to his closest rebelling aide. No mercy, no compromise. The stubborn defiance, actions, confidence and attitude of Colonel Yerton clearly display the template for the Death Korps of KRIEG. The man was absolutely unshakable, and he never even intended to create the Death Korps in the first place. They simply came into existence out of necessity. With the execution of his rebelling officers, there is nothing to stop Colonel Yerton from unleashing nuclear apocalypse upon the world of KRIEG. In these last moments though, Yerton makes an additional, devastating further calculation. He rationalises that one missile is not enough, because whilst one missile, even if it were to successfully hit its target, inevitably risks retaliation by the powerful air force of the traitors. If they were to mark the missile silo as a target in retaliation, they'd be finished. He also considered philosophically that at this point, no matter the actions that were taken, the world he once knew was already dead. It couldn't be saved in the true sense at this point. The war, the bitterness, the factions were far too embedded. Thus, Yerton concludes, his only option is the annihilation of the world using all the atomic weapons, a conclusion that Archmagos Griel had already long realised, but chose not to even voice. As all the missiles were fired, few of the enemy could really comprehend what they were seeing. Such weaponry was far beyond the experience of anyone in this time, so few worlds had experienced the forbidden weapons of the Dark Age of humanity despite the advanced time for the humans in the Imperium. So even the traitors in their city were unable to comprehend what Yerton had hoped to achieve with such a small burst of missiles. A tiny volley would do nothing to their hardened, reinforced outer walls of Hive City Oros. The general was alerted but remained entirely unconcerned. Strangely though, these missiles appeared to be flying straight up. They were not seeking any specific target. The reasoning of course was that directly targeting enemy positions or the hive was calculated to be now too risky. The missiles would probably be intercepted, and this is why Yerton and the Archmagos had decided to explode them in a manner that would ensure maximum destruction, albeit of a different kind of destruction, one of a slow, poisoning death purge rather than instant annihilation. So the scores of missiles would roar their way out from High Ferrograd as the traitor rebels watched on, confused and exposed across the open planet's surface. the hive cities of the traitors took no immediate action. Vents were not closed, protective shields not raised. None were able to understand their impending slow extermination. It should be noted that nuclear weapons are still very much used by the Imperium in the 41st millennium, but they're likely far more powerful than when they were originally conceived in the unknowable ancient history of humanity. The Mechanicus understand their power, not to mention generally being fearful of anything which originates from the Dark Age or beyond, because although it might appear clear what it is supposed to be, who knows once you start messing around with the mysterious languages from the Dark Age. So weapons such as these are usually kept, as we said, locked down heavily by the Mechanicus, only to be used in the most severe combat engagements. The fact that Imperial cyclonic torpedoes or other weapons used in the process of exterminatus are objectively more powerful should not understate the fear of causing long-term irradiated damage to our planet. This is why only during the Crusade and the subsequent Heresy did you see Space Marine destroyer squads using rad weapons. After the Heresy, these were effectively outlawed, and you very rarely see standard Imperial units using radiation-based weapons now because of the long-term damage that can be caused. So most of the weapons fired from Hive Ferrograd were deliberately detonated high, unleashing tons of lethal material and turning the very atmosphere of the world into a nuclear fire. The consequences of this would be a total collapse of the planet's ecosystem and climate, bizarre storms raged across the world, and the planet's sun was heavily obscured by the nuclear winter, which now consumed the entire planet. Of course, Jurten's forces had been apparently prepared in advance for this event, even if they didn't know the specifics. Some were left at their stations outside, presumably to maintain appearances, and the Archmagos presumably had the equipment necessary to help protect the Loyalists from the very worst conditions that were to come. As well as closing down all ventilation into their hive and water systems, the civilian population was secured deep underground. The traitor, General Kraus, would live long enough to see the devastation that Jurten had unleashed. His extreme bitterness and outrage must have been entirely visible. Both sides of the civil war on KRIEG were so dug in, literally, that when Jurten had last communicated to Kraus, he did not even attempt to discuss any possibility of surrender or compromise. It was clear that no discussion could be had, no chance of saving the world. Yet for Kraus, this new reality was something he could not have anticipated, made only worse by his now impending defeat. If not today, then surely very soon. Until this moment, the idea that he might lose the conflict, or that there were any chance of any other outcome than their glorious victory, had not even entered their minds. But now, as he looked across the feeds and reports of a burning world, a planetary ecosystem collapse, an atmosphere that was burning, his soldiers scrambled for any cover they could across the wasteland between hive cities, now pinned down by acid rain that burned through their armour and skin. For the leaders, this was intolerable to see. Kraus retreated to his quarters and shut himself into isolation. Meanwhile, panic was spreading among the traitors. They were leaderless, and their world was spiralling into a hellish nightmare in real time. Fields were burning, casualty reports were everywhere, water supplies contaminated, internal hive city atmosphere's toxicity readings were off the scale. For the general, some part of him undoubtedly even now was unwilling to accept defeat. There was too much pride, too much ego to face reality. Yet he felt undoubtedly panicked, for he could do nothing to stop this oncoming apocalypse. It is widely presumed that rather than face the impossible situation head-on, the traitor General Kraus took his own life. The traitor propaganda of course spun other stories to cover for the fact that they were the ones who had been led down this path to their own destruction. Kraus, like the chairman before him and so many random anonymous dictators across the galaxy, were left with a choice between remaining completely disconnected from reality and facing the fact that he had severely underestimated the enemy. He'd been consumed by his own hubris, lust for power, arrogance, and that it was all of this together which had now brought complete annihilation to their world. Interestingly, although the most likely outcome, even Imperial loyalists were not satisfied with this explanation, because it would mean that Kraus had escaped the ever-present wrath and inevitable justice of the Imperium. Colonel Jurten would be the first to see this new world. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, despite this being unnecessary. They had vid feeds that could show them the situation on the surface, but Jurten felt it important that he bear witness to the horror he had unleashed upon his world. He wore a face respirator to protect from the highly toxic air that would burn him internally. He wore a heavy coat to protect against the intense cold and some of the radiation blowing across the world. Those at the surface level may never see the sun again. Unknowingly, Jurten would be the first to wear the uniform that would soon become synonymous with the planet of KRIEG. For any of the traitor rebels who were left outside and within also the other hive worlds, they would suffer considerably more. The severe radiation that fell upon the planet, far more than even the most ancient weapons of humanity, would lead to the steady deaths of billions, not to mention the physical harm immediately caused. The survivors remained wounded, dishevelled, disorientated, generally in a state of shock. And this is where Jurten's Death Riders began to scour enemy lines of survivors. A small adjacent note, one of the very notable units of KRIEG before and after the apocalypse were their Death Riders. As the hugely destructive war had raged across KRIEG, it had become increasingly difficult for both loyalists and traitors to use tanks and other vehicles, primarily because of the ongoing war of attrition, and this meant that logistical supplies quickly became scarce, coupled with the knowledge and the manpower needed to pilot the vehicles and keep them operational. This was impeded severely as the casualty list increased exponentially every day. On top of this, the devastating use of artillery and trenches meant that the land itself became extremely difficult to traverse, so the Archmagos had the surprising non-mechanicus idea to use mounted cavalry to give them an edge over the enemy. Breeding and heavily genetically modifying the variety of equine on the world was not a challenging task, gifting it a physique far stronger than a Terran horse. Its new adaptation enabled the mount to power through thick mud or over rubble, with its splayed feet also better to adapting and moving in difficult or nearly impassable terrain. They could be bred quite quickly with the technology available, and so war horses were raised to be ridden as specially trained cavalry companies for the loyalists. Psychologically, these creatures are far more aggressive than their domestic Terran ancestors, with drug injectors being used to make the creature fearless in the face of an enemy. In battle, the creature will charge directly into the foe's lines and will not be startled by weapons fire or explosions. Due to the KRIEG steed's unstable body chemistry, it has to be constantly monitored by its rider and stabilized with additional chemicals. This means the creature can sustain also injuries that would kill lesser creatures, but leaves many of these mounts with horrible scars from previous wounds. The results even prior to the apocalypse were impressive, and often caught the enemy completely by surprise. The speed of their attacks in the horrifying conditions, combined with them being very easily replaceable, made them valuable for a variety of roles. In the aftermath, the steeds of KRIEG were even more critical, enabling fast raids on heavily weakened enemy positions, allowing the riders to attack or recon enemy trench lines and return to the safety of the hive while minimizing their time out in the open air. The KRIEG steed would be equipped with armor to protect its head, and a respirator system was adapted to protect them, as it would their riders, from poison gases and toxic atmospheres. In the modern period, these Death Rider mounts would now be grown in vitagenic cloning vats deep below the surface, with their gestation carefully monitored by the Mechanicus biologists. They're all branded at the genetic level for any necessary identification purposes. So, the extreme conditions that now existed on the planet's surface also meant that realistically any major assaults between the hive cities was becoming quickly impossible, at least in the short term, thus enabling Jurten and the Loyalists more time to dig in, consolidate their positions, and resist against the rebels, who were reeling from the massive change to the planet, and their own hive cities and populations were heavily contaminated. Their leaders' arrogant overconfidence meant that the attack had caught them at their weakest and least prepared. They suffered heavily during the initial fallout, while the planet was being lashed by nuclear fire, and the extremely strong radioactive fallout crippled a massive amount of the enemy forces, who were now either extremely sickened, walking wounded, blinded, or any other number of ailments. Many were just suffering from extreme mental depression and disillusionment at the state of their world at this point. Suffice to say, the will to fight and the morale of the enemy was at rock bottom. Many would surrender, take their own lives, or just engage in pointless assaults. The nuclear annihilation unleashed by Colonel Jurten had turned the prosperous industrial and agricultural world into a barren, dead, irradiated wasteland. KRIEG was no longer a hive world, it had become quite literally the most feared classification of Imperial planet, a death world. For those, mainly loyalists, who lived to see the aftermath, This event would become known as the Purging. Surprisingly though, the devastation only really evened the odds for the Loyalists, which sounds surprising, but still even odds was far better than certain destruction. But it did come at a horrifying cost for the planet. Colonel Yerton of course had very few cards to play, and so we might consider that it was perhaps a little unfair that after hearing of the destruction of KRIEG, the Imperium no longer saw KRIEG as a viable planet, meaning it was no longer worth investing resources to recover or save. The Loyalists of KRIEG were effectively abandoned, and the Imperium communicated it had no further plans to send nor deploy any reinforcements to aid the Loyalists. No Imperial Guard, certainly no Astartes. Colonel Yerton and his remaining Loyalists were left to fight this war themselves, the outcome of which would determine their ultimate fate: acceptance of some form back into the Imperium, or an unknown fate, potentially permanent isolation upon a dead world, or even some final act of complete annihilation to scour any remaining traitors from the planet, likely exterminatus. For the people of KRIEG, after this act of extreme destruction, the war did not end. Their world was now changed forever, and what remained was a truly miserable, bleak reality that awaited all who had survived. They now entered into a protracted and extremely difficult period of continuing the fighting amid the now extreme and apocalyptic environment of their planet's surface. The atmospheric conditions allowed for little if any air cover, and so the war further devolved into a horrific planetary trench warfare. Week by week, each side would extend their lines and fortifications until every space that could be filled contained dugout trench defences, razor wire and bunkers. There is very little information about this gruelling war of attrition between the Loyalists and traitors, likely due to the fact that one week became another, and another, and another. Lives were lost, ground gained, lost, enemy killed, ground gained, and lost. Various factors complicated the war, not least the environment above the surface, but also of course the distances between the hive cities, which were now very difficult to navigate and littered with vast labyrinthine trench networks. Artillery bombarded the enemy day and night. In rare extreme events it said that there were even still additional atomics used, but just how, or where, or which side were using these is unknown. So when Yerton and his forces finally assaulted Hive Argentus, the remnants of humanity they encountered were ragged, uncoordinated, carrying barely functioning weaponry. They lacked strength, willpower, were truly pitiful creatures. But as Yerton exclaimed, they were the ones who brought this horror to their world, which is obviously very arguable, but they were to be shown no mercy, only death. They were slaughtered more like putting them out of their misery, despite Yerton's proclamations. Many months later, the new fighters of the Loyalists were being referred to as Corpsmen. Those who were sent out into the wastes were ever more ferocious in their Loyalist zeal, and they were laser focused on their singular task to bring death to the enemy. It was said that not long after, Yerton learned how the population of High Ferrograd had begun referring to these as the Death Korps, the Death Korps of KRIEG. The name stuck. Colonel Yerton would die of a weakened body state not too long after this period, yet Yerton was an officer who believed there should be no observable difference between officers of the Imperium and the soldiers they would command. He always would stay within quarters comparable to his own men. For Yerton, he would often state that the only difference between an officer and lower ranked soldiers was the level of responsibility. He was a humble man, and so in death, where upon other worlds the passing of such a critical officer would warrant ostentatious marble statues worked upon by master artisans, plaques to adorn public spaces, and stories told to the new generations. Upon KRIEG, the death of Yerton was merely a footnote in one or other of the data files. But still, all knew his name, all knew his importance. The people of KRIEG would never allow him to be forgotten, yet his death and legacy generally would pass without audacious commentary. What endured from the man who followed his orders absolutely, stood strong against traitors, and would destroy an entire world as the Emperor's representative, rather than kowtow to the mad ravings of a power-mad despot, was his unbreakable sense of willpower. Colonel Yerton was in perhaps more ways than just the aspirational, the template to which all KRIEG guardsmen who came between then and now would follow. If an order is given, it must be followed at any cost. If an objective cannot be saved, then better it be destroyed. If a world cannot be defended, it should burn. Better that than it fall to the traitors and heretics. Most importantly, of course, no sacrifice should be too great in service to the Imperium and the Emperor of mankind. Yet what occurred within his final hours, and in the time since his passing, would shape the reputation and future for the people of KRIEG forevermore. One of the greatest questions all have wondered is what lies behind the masks of the Death Korps of KRIEG. Even the Inquisition have forced the issue when first encountering the Death Korps upon the world's reunification with the Imperium. As always, I want to be clear that the answer remains unclear. It has not been stated specifically what lies behind the masks of the Death Korps. However, we can reasonably strongly speculate based on the information available. For one, we know that the Inquisition have forcibly ordered KRIEG officers and soldiers to remove their masks, and although what they saw was unrevealed to us, the fact that the Death Korps continue to remain in service points to them not being abhorrent mutants, traitors, heretics or otherwise. There have been many obvious speculations over the years, and the one which is often repeated, the one with the most weight behind it, does seem to be the case, that the Death Korps of KRIEG are something akin to a clone army. Now just how close that practice is upon KRIEG is not entirely clear, but it does point to their usage of the Vitae womb and the fact that this is frowned upon by the Mechanicus Biologus. In the final hours of Colonel Yerton's life, Archmagos Griel presses him to make a decision about the soldiers of KRIEG. Griel remonstrates with Yerton that only his strength of leadership, only his willpower, his character, can be certain to endure the future horrors that are necessary to carry the Loyalists through to the distant time when they will finally reunite with the Imperium. Colonel Yerton is one of those figures who really likes to be in control. He wants to do everything himself. He feels frustrated when he leaves it to others, and Griel attempts to essentially leverage this feeling, saying, "Do you trust leaving KRIEG in the hands of these other officers?" But Yerton, when pushed, will not submit to Griel's pressuring. Sometime later, when called upon by the new commander of the Loyalists, the Archmagos lies to the new senior officers in charge of Hive Ferrograd. After the passing of Colonel Yerton, he insists that Yerton wanted to mandate the use of the so-called Vitae wombs to be used by KRIEG, to the shock of the officers in the room. The birth rate, though, was declining, mutations increasing, and it appears that the Archmagos tricked the KRIEG population into the use of the Vitae wombs, because they were now in the belief that this was Colonel Yerton's dying wish, something they could not, of course, oppose. The reality was that he went to his death choking strongly on his protestation of any such action. Anyone who truly knew Colonel Yerton would have known that he would not have been more strongly opposed to anything that artificially interferes in human development, as he had been his entire life seemingly. Now, as I've talked about before, we do not know precisely how Vitae wombs work or even what they are, but it is suggestive that they require some kind of initial implantation from the way in which Archmagos Griel speaks to them. It sounds as if a fertilized embryo is required to be placed within this womb, but then it is also genetically modified so that it grows into what is near enough a clone of Colonel Yerton. It feels like something along those lines, but again, it's really my own just logical assumptions on the information we have. It's just heavily implied by the conversations between the Archmagos and Yerton and the others, hence the fact that he was so angrily resistant to the use of Vitae wombs, plus the fact that the Mechanicus Biologus frowned so heavily upon their use. The Mechanicus in general and the Imperium appear to generally hate anything that appears to be clone-based. It seems to go strongly against the strange ethical rules for the Imperium. Look at the Astartes, they're not clones, they're individuals who are just adapted to become Space Marines. But it's very weird that the Imperium has these kind of sort of ethical qualms, because they don't seem to apply these ever for anything else, and when they do, it's usually not for the reasons you'd want or expect. Archmagos Griel believed that the only way for the KRIEG armies to be powerful enough to survive a war of attrition was for their number to be filled with the strongest warriors possible, those who could decisively win in battles, who were unbreakable servants to the Emperor, and who were uncompromising in every respect. Essentially, he was suggesting that they would create an army of Colonel Yertons. He didn't say that, but it seems to be what he's suggesting. There's also this implied sense that Archmagos Griel always knows what has to be done and what would be eventually the conclusion before Yerton knew it himself. So in that sense, in Colonel Yerton's deathbed, Griel understands that his protestations were merely the delay point between the clarity he would eventually gain in realizing this was an action that had to be taken, and so Griel basically joins the dots. This is generally pretty normal actually for Mechanicus as well, because they're often far ahead in thought processes compared to ordinary humans. Griel seemed to be just a very patient member of the Mechanicus and was allowing Colonel Yerton to work it out for himself so as to not draw his irritation. Plus, there's always that thing of if you try and force someone to have an opinion, it never really works, but if you let them get there themselves by just giving them the information and enabling them to figure it out, even if it takes some time, they're going to be much more on board. Plus it probably helps in the long run. So there are many subtle references to this. It's just kind of reading between the lines. For one, Yerton speaks about wishing that he could be the one to meet face to face with the Imperium and show them just what he had achieved. Griel also knew this. He knows that it had been Colonel Yerton's dream to raise this vast army upon the world that would stun and shock the Imperium when they eventually returned, which of course it did. Lastly, there is the most glaring detail that the officer of the Kriegsman who first revealed his name to the Imperium announces himself as one Colonel Yerton, which he obviously isn't. This is combined with the fact that the Krieg Guardsmen also just generally appear confused when they meet the Imperium after such a long time. They're asked what their names are. They seem very confused by this because they have no personal identity, they don't need names. Now, of course, I have to add, we could speculate that this was just a symbolic act, that the Krieg merely continue the honour of Colonel Yerton by carrying his name forward. But I think the reality with what we know of what took place in the aftermath, the sheer pressing necessity of the Vitae wombs, this constant air of unease about their use, everybody seems to understand that they're pretty dodgy, but just without actually explaining why. The fact that the Kriegsmen never remove their face masks, it's all heavily suggestive of, if not a clone army, at least something very close to it. The apocalyptic surface of KRIEG was now a ghostly dystopian wasteland, the very soil of which could contaminate and heavily sicken you. Vast craters pockmarked the planet from the repeated artillery strikes, many so deep that any who fell in were as good as dead themselves, pits of death which were filled with shattered remnants of humans from generations previous. All manner of horrifying anti-infantry weapons littered the surface, from impossibly dense thickets of rusted wire to devious, shredding mines which jumped out without warning to cut you off at the legs, waist, or just shred your body entirely. Any attempts to advance and secure trenches were extremely dangerous. The enemy would always lay traps and tools to sabotage advances. Over time, the battling forces upon KRIEG had begun to develop a look that was indeed necessary for their survival across the inhospitable trench wastelands. Inspired by Colonel Yerton as he had ventured into the wastes on that first day, they wore standardised heavy greatcoats to protect them from the frozen environment and distinctive respirators to protect against the toxic atmosphere, which unfortunately for the soldiers of KRIEG now had to be worn basically at all times. Over time, many would stylize their face masks with a skull-like decal, but this was not really for intimidating the enemy, although it often could be. because their battles were often really fought at distance with artillery, and when they actually did fight close enough in a battle to see one another, both were wearing respirator masks. So no, the skull design for most of the Death Korps was to indicate their total acceptance of their own death. It was a symbolic thing. Most squads had very high rates of casualties, even now fighting against the weakened enemy. In addition to the more obvious pieces of kit, leg greaves could be worn for extra protection, or otherwise tightly wrapped compression cloths on the legs to help with the long periods spent standing in cold, filthy trenches. Depending on their role, equipment could vary slightly in terms of specific carapace armour. Helmets and other shoulder, knee and shin guards were generally made of plasteel, reinforced with a ceramite layer. These were said to be heat resistant and were lesser in weight to other options. Nonetheless, all of this outerwear worn atop their standard issue uniform made it quite cumbersome and difficult to move in. Not so much of a problem when you're standing around in trenches, and this meant that the gear was only generally worn during static engagements or defensive operations. Whilst any of course welcomed the protection of the heavy carapace plates, it would be sometimes necessary to discard these for fast-moving extended operations, such as attempting to breach enemy positions. For the coming generations, all they would know was war and underground life. They were brought into a world with no sky above them, only darkness, toxic pollution, the inevitability and visible presence of death, and the inhuman machinery and execution of industrial-scale warfare in M41. And so, the grinding battle for KRIEG continued on. Its soldiers developed this apathetic indifference to human life, but for the loyalists their goal remained to crush the traitors, who, through their sheer arrogance and doubt as to the willpower of those who serve the Imperium, had unwittingly enabled both the destruction of their world and the arrival of some of the most unbreakable human soldiers that existed within the Imperial Guard. The loyalist soldiers who ventured into the irradiated wastelands of KRIEG were no longer the 83rd who had served under Colonel Yerton. The soldiers who now walked unwaveringly into their inevitable deaths, all but anonymously, for those who would fight in dark, freezing trenches, who charged enemy lines and battled through broken, destroyed ruins of former hive cities, these unbreakable warriors became known among the survivors of the Loyalists, the Death Korps of KRIEG. Their existence remained to serve and die upon the hellish environment of KRIEG, to crush the enemies of the Imperium in the Emperor's name, and through half a millennia of grinding attrition and brutal industrial war, this is exactly what they did. The citizens of KRIEG by now had developed new cities in the only area they could now survive, below the surface. Meanwhile, the Death Korps continued to fight with unrelenting determination, regularly in hand-to-hand combat with bayonet and shovel over mere meters of trenches. They would fight in the darkness of subterranean tunnels or the freezing, blasted wastelands, bludgeoning their enemies into submission amid the blood, mud, and shattered human remains. KRIEG would eventually be returned to the Imperium, but not until the late period of M40. The Imperium had, of course, been monitoring the situation on KRIEG. It had just remained unwilling to contribute any resources to what had presumed to be a lost cause. General opinion as to what had occurred upon KRIEG remained unsurprisingly not a positive one. So despite the enduring efforts of the loyalist people of KRIEG, despite their near incalculable sacrifice and centuries of suffering by those serving in the Death Korps, there was no celebration or relief for KRIEG when it returned to the Imperium. In fact, quite the contrary. The people of KRIEG were simply met with a terse, emotionless statement that the world of KRIEG had been assessed as now being behind on paying the Imperial tithe. The delays caused by this unnecessary civil war meant that KRIEG now was heavily in debt to the wider Imperium. As with the majority of Imperial Hive worlds, the Imperial tithe was to be paid by contribution of soldiers for the Munitorum. However, the adepts of the Munitorum, who had perhaps expected protestation from the newly liberated world of KRIEG, were shocked when the representatives who joined them aboard the Imperial ship in orbit of the world offered up 20 whole regiments, and additionally requested them to be deployed to the most severe of warzone environments. Now I'll interject here with a small adjacent reference, because this is not an uncommon action of self-penance. It's similar to the planet of Vostroya, which you may have also heard of. During the heresy, Vostroya refused to provide soldiers and materials to either side of the conflict. Extremely bizarrely, they had somehow determined their best bet was to remain neutral, undamaged, and productive. Oddly, the ruling authority of the world had presumed that by remaining impartial, this would then limit damage to the world, and of course by not siding with anyone, come off all the better for it on the other side. Obviously, this is not how things turned out. In the aftermath of the heresy, this decision by Vostroya was not viewed positively. In fact, the opposite. Realizing their catastrophic error and the impending heavy punishment headed their way, Vostroyan leadership would make a declaration to the Imperium in an attempt to prevent it being punished even more severely that every firstborn child of the world would be sworn to the Imperium's service forevermore. 10,000 years have passed since then, but for the people of Vostroya in M41, not all are aware about the specific details, but the scar upon their world cut so deep that even now, millennia later, all know that when the Emperor needed them, they turned away. And this deep, deep shame has meant that ever since that time, they continue to commit their firstborn to forever fight in the name of the Imperium in an attempt to scrub clean their indelible stain of shame which remains upon their world and in the light of the Imperium always will. So the point is that, like Vostroya, the leadership of KRIEG at the end of M40 understood that although they had avoided total annihilation in one sense, they now needed to show the Imperium that it was still a planet worth saving, not to mention, of course, fulfilling Colonel Yerton's long-standing wish and order that they should deliver a mighty army to demonstrate how successful he had carried out his campaign upon KRIEG and how the world could still remain important for the Imperium. Although the collapse of the planet into civil war was not the fault of the Loyalists, the fact remained that the sheer scale of waste that had occurred upon a previously stable and productive Imperial planet was undeniable. The deployment of the new Death Korps Imperial Guard units was a resounding success. To the considerable surprise and shock of those within the Munitorum, the Death Korps quickly proved themselves far superior, entering into engagements that had ground to a halt with other regiments, most obviously in war zones that mirrored KRIEG itself, toxic environments, polluted ashen worlds, and where other Guard forces had struggled considerably, the KRIEG soldiers carried on as if it were very literally a world without any such inhospitable conditions to contend with, to the astonishment of their superiors. Senior officers were in awe as the Death Korps broke bitter stalemates with ease and achieved strategic advances that would have otherwise required the slaughter of thousands of penal legion troops to achieve the same results. In some instances, Imperial officers had been waiting for Astartes' assistance to resolve hard-to-crack situations, but the Death Korps of KRIEG stepped in and immediately smashed the problem. So now KRIEG exists as purely a world of war, both in its production, but also the fighting continues across its heavily scarred terrain. But why? Well, very simple, training for the Death Korps. Because it of course became apparent that the Death Korps was so effective because they had been tempered in the brutally unforgiving warfare that had raged across their planet for centuries. And the Imperium continues to demand this standard level of skill and service from the Death Korps that remains above other guardsmen. The Death Korps face such a high rate of attrition and destruction wherever they're sent to that consequently they must be steeled to face such nightmarish conditions. Where an ordinary hive planet may raise one new guard regiment per year, KRIEG continues to contribute as many as 10. The Imperium remains insatiable in M41. It needs more and more of the Death Korps to fight in its ever more extreme wars, such as Octarius and the ongoing war fought in, around and through the Cicatrix Maledictum. While the Death Korps are undoubtedly highly skilled, disciplined and unbreakable, they also lean heavily on their nature of being disposable to achieve victory. And this can often be used to an advantage, especially when they have already been fighting more standard Imperial Guard. It can catch an enemy by surprise as suddenly they throw themselves against scenarios that would be considered entirely pointless engagements. And while this brings the Death Korps victory, it often will come at an extortionately high cost in human life and material equipment. Sometimes this is warranted, but other times it can in fact be somewhat counterproductive, which remains this strange duality for the Death Korps of KRIEG. Effective, a sledgehammer to an enemy, but bleak and demoralizing for any adjacent forces who have to cooperate and support them. For the distant eyes of the Imperial Administratum and the Munitorum, however, they do not see the human cost, they do not see the morale of allies, they simply see numbers on a data slate, they see terms such as defeat or success. In their eyes, nothing else matters other than the final result. Briefly circling back around, where other planets would produce ore or munitions or agri-products, KRIEG produces the Death Korps, and nothing else. It produces soldiers, endless new regiments for the Imperium to send to the most hellish environments and war zones imaginable. For the Imperium though, the considerably suspicious part about this was the fact that although KRIEG had seemed enthusiastic to contribute on its return to the Imperium, with the obvious assumption that its contribution of soldiers was in part to serve its penance for past problems, but then more surprisingly, this rate of contribution continued. How were they able to suddenly churn out masses upon masses of endless new soldiers, especially considering how damaged the planet had been as a result of its 500-year war? So an inspection by the Mechanicus biologist team points to something that those upon KRIEG had been keeping fairly quiet about, namely because it was very much considered abhorrent in many ways by the Mechanicus. So obviously, as we noted earlier, they found that upon KRIEG in past centuries, the Loyalists had begun the use of these vitae wombs. Now again, as we said before, details sparse, but seemingly the power of the Death Korps of KRIEG and how successful they are in all combat deployments led the Imperium and Mechanicus to effectively turn a blind eye to just how they're produced, which seems both comical and a stinging jab at the legacy of Colonel Yurton. This is only confirmed by the fact that when they came back under the rule of the Imperium, this process was knowingly exploited by the High Lords of Terror, because the extreme effectiveness of the Death Korps trumped really any other concerns. Their ability to just hammer out vast numbers of KRIEG soldiers led them to being slapped with this maximum tithe level, whereby KRIEG would contribute the highest levels of physical manpower to the Imperium. They existed now purely to produce the Death Korps of KRIEG and nothing else. So KRIEG as a world and society already walks on the wrong side of the line when it comes to ethics, and so it's speculated they inevitably also dabble in things like abhorrent eugenic policies, all out of sight and out of mind, deep in their underground cities, which farm out new humans as factories turn out new rifles. More troubling though is the fact that the actual nature of what a vitae womb is feels like the most concerning aspect here, not least because it remains deliberately vague, and within the world of 40k, things that are not described clearly are very probably the things that you really want to be worrying about. So a vitae womb could be anything from a part organic cybernetic birth chamber to some far more horrifying scenario where they use actual wombs harvested and then somehow incorporated into a mechanical device to enable ongoing battery farm birthing, and yes, of course, the many other more edgy scenarios as well. And one of those more edgy scenarios that someone could speculate upon would be that perhaps vitae wombs are female servitors, lobotomized human-machine hybrids used as birthing machines for newborn Death Korps soldiers. The Mechanicus, we know, look upon humans as they look upon machines. There are descriptions in some of the Warhammer crime series of servitor production, how they're actually made. Pretty horrific. It's definitely up there. So the Mechanicus are undoubtedly very uncaring, certainly with no real sense of human morality. It would not be out of the realm of possibility for one as ruthless as Archmagos Griel, and then, as with all servitors, just used until they're no longer functional and then sent on for organic recycling. Very harrowing, disturbing, but unfortunately all too reasonable possibilities for the nightmarish world of 40k. My own personal view, and please take note this is all entirely again my own speculation because so little is given to us about the vitae wombs. To me, the process is more oviparous. It doesn't require human hosts or anything like this that are traumatically forced into some endless birthing thing. Because for one, that's really only a step away from Daemonculaba, and two, it seems a little much, even for the horror of the Imperium, but still, you never know. Now, I would speculate that the KRIEG citizenry are mandatorily assessed as to the stability of their own genetics within the unstable, irradiated conditions of living on KRIEG. If they are stable, then they're considered a valid donor for source material, which is then harvested. Maybe they get some extra credits per month or something like that. And then Mechanicus techs will artificially make embryos, which are then further manipulated or screened before being implanted into the vitae wombs, which are then further altered by whatever process makes them into these near enough clones. The actual growth and birth process I envisage as, again, it must happen quite rapidly and more akin to the way the shark family reproduces, whereby individuals are grown by these exterior egg sacs, and it's this that would be constructed from womb-like organic material, like a big shark egg sac but for a human. Hundreds of individuals strung up like a meat processing factory, injected and monitored for abnormality. Any flaws or weaknesses lead to them being, of course, instantly flushed and reprocessed for their organic matter. Once they reach a state of full growth, they're unceremoniously dumped out onto a cold metallic floor with drainage to allow the amniotic fluid to drain away. Servitors would drag these shivering newborn humanoids of likely, say, a late teenage age. Maybe they arrive already kickstarted with some learning and information, false memories, some framework like this built into them to allow them to still engage and behave like humans to a degree. Probably akin to replicants from Blade Runner, or maybe they go through a further process of condensed, intensive learning. They would only be partially conscious in these sort of first 24 hours, later they awake in vast hive dormitories, not really understanding how they arrived there, only knowing their purpose, the general order of things. Their indoctrination already teaches them that to question such things is irrelevant and punishable, all of this before the general KRIEG ideology and distinct lack of concern for physical losses begins to be pounded into their minds on a daily basis. Still, whatever the reality, the critical aspect is that this happens on an industrial scale, and no matter the process and means of achieving the material, vitae wombs suddenly sit at the lower to sump level of the ethical and moral scale. Such things are not something many are greatly troubled by in the 41st millennium. Either way, vitae wombs are not apparently a commonplace reality for the Imperium. In fact, they're seemingly the exception, not the standard. Thankfully. The modern Death Korps of KRIEG in M41 have maintained much of their outlook and doctrine from the centuries previous when they fought through their bitter civil war. Its combat doctrine and cult of individual sacrifice are taught as being integral to the effectiveness and superior power of their regiments. In the days of the brutal civil war, the Death Korps simply could not afford to support those weaker individuals who fell behind, and so the nature of the Death Korps is unforgiving. It places emphasis on cooperation but not support among the individual. Their primary approach continues to be, unsurprisingly, to deluge an enemy with overwhelming, unrelenting force no matter the casualties. Their doctrine dictates that any battle where they have the capacity to fight and their willingness to die exceeds that of their enemy is a battle which is effectively a win by default. Any actions in between are just a means to an end, time and material attrition. Not dissimilarly to the Astartes, the Imperial Guard will use specific training practices for regiments, and the Death Korps are of course no exception. Unsurprisingly, they are somewhat more extreme than others in how this is implemented. From as soon as they're able to, those young members of the Death Korps are tested extensively, and even at this point failure and even fatalities are high. What happens to the failures? Unknown. Penal legions, industrial servitude, servitors, or even perhaps again biological recycling back into the production of new Death Korps soldiers. It's all possible. As with so very much training within the Imperium, it's your standard fare of mental and physical endurance, breaking them down in every way possible, seeing who can survive. Survival upon KRIEG itself, even below the surface, is no small thing, but for those who advance to the final stage of their training, this is where those remain will either become Death Korps or die. The recruits are sent out upon their most harrowing test of all, survival on the surface of KRIEG, under the supervision of senior KRIEG officers. The surface of KRIEG continues to remain this nightmarish landscape of apocalypse even centuries past the end of the civil war upon the world. There was never any need to reclaim or repair it, so there it now stands, the annihilated scars of the world whose very name is war. And into this hellscape walk the new recruits for the Death Korps. They will spend many months out here, marching around the trenches and across the wastelands in freezing conditions. They'll walk through heavily irradiated zones and endure fallout storms, They're made to navigate the massive wreckage of ancient war machines, dig out old trenches in the freezing conditions, clear extremely dangerous minefields, and even fight out mock but live fire battles against other KRIEG recruits where casualties, even fatal, will be taken. Only those who survive will be assigned to serve the greater good far across the galaxy in the most hellish battles imaginable, to serve the Emperor and all planets of the Imperium as members of the legendary Death Korps of KRIEG. Now, if you're thinking this is the end, of course no. We have plenty left to discuss when it comes to the Death Korps of KRIEG. For those of you who will inevitably ask in the comments yet not watch to the end of this video, I will of course plan on discussing that little detail of the world of Vrax. But not yet. A new year approaches and a lot more content yet to come. The Death Korps of KRIEG believe in a level of human sacrifice that few if any other regiments of the Imperial Guard can stomach. Despite the fact that the Imperial way of war is to literally drown the enemy in a tsunami of human soldiers, for the more mainstream Imperial Guard though, they still believe in traits such as infantry morale, tactical retreats, waiting for charging assaults when, the odds are in your favour. By contrast, the Death Korps of KRIEG and their terrifying apathy for human life is indoctrinated into them at a cultural, perhaps even genetic level. Other Imperial regiments will watch on in horror as the soldiers of KRIEG willingly run into enemy fire that will literally tear them to pieces. Yet they still run headlong into the fight, for if one of them should secure their objective, all others who fell before were merely a necessary means to an end. The Death Korps are in many ways perhaps the cleanest distillation and the purest doctrine of the Imperium, for they fully accept and demonstrate that their lives are forfeit. They exist only to fight and die for the Emperor and the Imperium, and for nothing more. They would send thousands to certain death and ask for more. They see their lives and that of the others as currency for the Imperium of human flesh and bone. They are the tide that breaks upon the rocks of Xenos bastions. Feared as much as they are respected by fellow guardsmen, inspiring as much as they are depressing. The soldiers of KRIEG have long seen the truth of the Imperium, that to preserve what exists, humanity must pour its most powerful weapon down upon the enemies of humanity, without pause and without doubt. The equation for the Death Korps is simple: action or annihilation. The collective debt of their world exists in their minds as being insurmountable. Their fates are determined by the God Emperor. They are bred and trained to fight, to die, and to hammer the enemies of the Imperium. For their past sins, they try to redress the balance, condemned now to repay it forever. Bitter defiance no matter the odds, victory at any cost. No mercy, no surrender. The KRIEG way is uncompromisingly simple and best described in their own words. We shall bleed the enemy to death before they can bleed us. So let's talk about my next selection for Audible. The reason I wanted to suggest two selections today is because both KRIEG and the Gaunt series offer something quite clearly different. KRIEG focuses in on, very obviously, the Death Korps of KRIEG, and it probes several perspectives about the Imperium. It allows us a look at those who might seek to throw off the shackles of the Imperium's rule, and the stark contrasts between those who would defend it and those who would wage on a grandiose scale of attrition trench warfare. The Gaunt series paints us a picture of far more rich individual characters, which are by now the stuff of legends within the lore of 40k. KRIEG gives us a pretty detailed exploration of the Death Korps, as much as is possible in both their history and from the eyes of other members of the Imperial Guard. It's a thoroughly good listen, and it addresses the dark history of the planet of KRIEG, Colonel Yurton, and it addresses for us the Civil War, the decisions which led to the creation of the Death Korps. It also brings to us the KRIEG Death Korps as they are today, fighting within the Octarius war zone. It blends together much that is modern about the Imperial Guard and brings to us the bleak horror of the Death Korps of KRIEG. It hammers home a solid picture of just what it means to fight and die for the Emperor in the galaxy of the far future. Gaunt's Ghost First and Only, well, there's little I can say without spoiling such a legendary opening to an amazing series. So I think best you just find out for yourself. It focuses on the region known as the Sabbat Worlds, which is a fascinating and particular favourite for me, especially Saint Sabbat herself. Obviously Gaunt is a very character-driven series, so if you're a fan of memorable characters that you follow through a narrative journey, you can't go wrong here. KRIEG, although it has its characters, is more of an overview, somewhat historically, of how they came to be. Both though, well worth a listen, especially at the Christmas time where we have a bit of downtime, want to relax, have a nice listen, paint some models, that kind of thing. So KRIEG and First and Only, my two recommends for this month. As a final reminder, if you're new to all of this, you can start listening today, and new members always get that free 30-day Audible trial. As a member, you're going to get full access to thousands of audiobooks, originals and podcasts included in the Plus catalogue. Visit audible.com/Lutin or text Lutin to 500 500 for those in the US. Thanks as always to all of you for your support, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.